Historical revision is a good thing. Now, you'll hear a lot of people use the term revisionist or revisionist history as an automatic bad thing. And there's cause for that because there are nefarious doers out there who revise history for reasons that are political and also for the purpose of distorting the reality of how things actually occurred. However, there's also good revision, and revision is absolutely necessary in history. Some of the things we need to grasp in terms of how history works is we don't always know exactly how things happened, and things can come to light that will alter our way of looking at things. Take a really good example. Let's say we have an event that occurs, and perhaps it's something that we're going to care about 100 years from now. The event occurs, a person who's there tells everything they saw, and they give you the date, the location, what happened, all the pertinent details, and we say, well, there's our historical event. We'll record it, and 100 years from now, we'll know. We can look back at it and say, we know what happened on this date. But we run into problems because, especially when we get back before the era of recording equipment, we are relying entirely on eyewitness testimony and then those who record it. And a lot of times, the eyewitnesses themselves may have not been the people who did the recording. So a lot of times the accounts are secondhand, somebody else recording it. Now, even if you do get a direct eyewitness account, the awful thing of dealing with history is that your best eyewitness account of the event could be wholly fabricated. There are reasons people have to lie. Maybe the event as it actually happened makes them look bad. So they're going to alter the way things happened, the way they describe it, in order to make it sound better. Then you have the problem of the natural tendency of witnesses to not remember things correctly under stress. And then there's also story contamination, where one person has a dominant view of things, right or wrong, and the people around him hear that view and pick it up, and then they adopt it thinking that, that's what I saw too. You also run the problem of the people who are, let's say, call it a historian on, in the era, may choose to record or not record things that are going on based on how they want things to come out. And then you also have the problem of information being either lost or deliberately hidden. Now imagine if you look at something like the United States of America now, how much classified information we have, especially when you're talking about foreign wars. So if we are deliberately hiding stuff now and presumably at least archiving it properly in hopes that someday it'll be presented, think about how much stuff that's happened in the last 100 years in relation to United States history that we may be missing absolutely critical details of because it's the information still being held. Well, jump back a couple hundred years more to some other country, they're probably doing very similar things. A war happens, classified information occurs, they put it in the archives, and then it gets lost. So there's a lot of things we don't truly understand about history. Now, when things pop up, new information, we have to weigh it against what we already know and see if this new information, if it's different, does it actually make the event more clear? Could it possibly be a honest version of something that we have that is actually dishonest? And then, of course, there's the methodology of history itself, because different historians have different theories on how history should be recorded. If we look back at Roman and Greek times, historians were not expected to provide a truthful account at all. They were expected to provide accounts that were practically almost like the stories of myth, where you have a main character and that main character needs to be a hero, or that main character needs to be a villain. And so it would not be any issue to them at all to knowingly fabricate a story about someone in order to build them up if they're the hero. And say, well, it's okay, because it's more important that posterity realizes how great this guy is than it is to know exactly what happened. And same thing with villainy. So that's one of the big problems we have with the history of that time period is, especially when we get to the Roman emperors, if they were reviled in their time, their stories may be padded with villainy that is far beyond anything they ever did. There's a lot of Roman historians are starting to wonder if the famous Caligula, how much of what was told about him is even close to being true, because of how much he was despised in his time. We have examples of, with Augustus, battles that he was supposedly the general of that were little more than skirmishes, and with huge monuments built to these incredible victories. And very little of a battle has even occurred at all. So do we stick with what was originally written down, or do we look at it and revise based on what we find? Now, you can always end up with counter revision, where you have like, okay, this is the way we were looking at things, now we change it because of new information that comes up, and then further down the line we look and say, yeah, maybe that new information wasn't as good as we thought it was. Let's either revert back to where it started or find some happy middle ground where the information makes more sense. In a lot of ways, a true historian's job is solving a mystery. Now, we do run into some other problems with historians, where it even goes into modern times, where historians may have a particular narrative that they think is important to be told. Like, for instance, if a particular war is seen as particularly heroic, they might be very they may very well feel like they don't want to report anything bad that happened. Let's keep it looking heroic. So let's make the heroic side look very heroic, and let's make the bad guys look even more bad. We also see that with historical figures. Historians have certain figures that they fall in love with. I mean, consider if you're a biographer, if you're writing to be the best biography of a particular historical figure, do you write stories about the people you really, really, really like, or the ones you absolutely hate? Well, there's a tendency of biographers to write about the people they like. And so if they were right about them right about the people they like, they're going to have inherent biases built into the storyline they come up with. And then there's a problem with, essentially, when the revisions do start coming out, there's a tendency of people to not like the change. And that's a bad function of our university system, where older historians, the professors who are tenured, the ones who are up there in years, they don't want to change what they've been teaching for 20 years. They're kind of comfortable, maybe a little lazy, so they do things the same way all over the place. So when they hear something new, they're resistant to incorporating it. And so we get a position where younger historians who may have found a new information are trying to get it out. Maybe in current days they're using the internet. They're trying to get their views out. But at the same time, these older professors of the history departments are blocking incorporation of this information. So you have a situation where you have to wait for these older professors to either go into absolute retirement, where they're not going to deal with not only teaching, but they're not even going to do interviews anymore, or waiting for them to die, while at the same time, these younger people coming up who found the new information or the new narratives have to stay with it long enough in order to get into a position where they can influence their department. So they might find something that someone discovers now could take 40 years or so until it gets into the mainstream, to where people are going, oh, wait a minute, that might be true. Well, then if you actually go to the mainstream itself, there's incredible resistance to these new stories, because it's like, well, this is what I learned in school, so this is what must be true. It's like, well, it was true as we can figure out, but it may not be as much anymore. And then, of course, then there's the problem with the stories that people really, really, really love that are just absolutely false. No matter how hard you try, the stories just keep coming back, because they're so good that they practically meet the Roman criterion of the perfect myth. So these stories get retold over and over again, even though there's no truth to them whatsoever. So some of the ideas that need revision, that people don't have a really good grasp on, things like the governmental period, especially the government side of things during the Revolutionary War and the interim period between when the Constitution comes online. Here we have a really good example of where the victors of history were the people who wrote the Constitution. Well, in order to justify the Constitution, it's important to make the period of the Articles of Confederation look as bad as possible, even though it was the same government that defeated the British Empire, paid off a large chunk of the debt that was owed due to the war, and was in the process of solving a lot of the interstate border issues that had gone on. Not saying that the whole period was perfect, but I'm just saying it's not the worst thing ever. But the Federalists who wrote the Constitution would like you to think it was the worst time ever. And there's also a problem with the birth of countries. We see this especially because we have good records for the birth of the United States and the birth of the Republic of France, where certain events are very mythological in nature, where even the general concept of how things happen have been altered. Where, like in the United States, instead of the British colonies of North America throwing off the yoke of the English Empire and then recasting themselves as Americans, they try to make it sound like we were two different people from the get-go. Because it's really confusing to say, well, we were both British for a while and then suddenly we weren't. French Republic, a lot of their revolutionary stories are very mythological. They like the idea of a spontaneous revolution of the people, when in fact all the evidence points to the contrary. See my video on establishments, and we'll probably get into the French Revolution in a future video for sure. Definitely we'll be getting into one on the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. And we run into issues with things like how various wars started, like World War I, World War II, Vietnam, where there were certain currents in play, certain political players desired entry into these wars, and it was important to make it appear like the United States was a true neutral throughout these wars, that just they were essentially dragged into these wars kicking and screaming. And that's a narrative that a lot of historians are still following. We're almost at the point where we're starting to see where people are starting to question the motives of Woodrow Wilson going into World War I, because Woodrow Wilson is such a truly horrible and awful person that he's now far enough out in history that people are starting to realize just how horrible and awful he was. So then when you start pointing out the other defects of his machinations in relation to World War I, they're now becoming more plausible to people, where they'll say, oh, yeah, he was bad enough to do something like that, so I'm willing to believe it. Look at something like Vietnam. Really good example where revision is critical is, obviously, we look at the Gulf of Tonkin. Pretty much everybody understands now that almost everything that happened in the Gulf of Tonkin was exaggerated or fabricated. The United States was not in international waters. They were maybe not fired upon at all. If they were fired upon, it was because there was a clandestine activity going on along the coast that the monitoring mission off the coast was unaware of, because one operation was CIA and the Navy couldn't be told about what was going on. But there's even deeper stuff to talk about Vietnam, essentially where the United States sets the entire thing up for failure and then changes the narrative to say, oh, yeah, it was never going to work, and we all kind of knew that. But that sounds like probably a good video to talk about in the future, too. And one of the nice things about modern age is we do get to see things a little faster. I mean, we look at the Gulf War I, the story of the babies in the incubators, and we find out that not too long, within a year, that the stories were wholly fabricated. The woman who was testifying was related to either the ambassador or the ambassadorial staff of Kuwait, and that the entire campaign to convince Americans we needed to go to war was run by a PR firm via the Kuwaiti embassy. So those are some ideas why revision is good and does exist. And we'll definitely get into some of those ideas when we're talking about historical events. And I'll have a tendency to lean a little bit on the establishment side of things where it's practical. We don't always know everything historical about what's going on with an establishment until long after the fact. So I hope this gives you a different viewpoint on revision, and I hope that whets your appetite to look at some of my other videos coming up. Thank you very much for your time.